Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome back to the How to Program with Java podcast. This is episode number 34, and you are listening to Trevor Page. So, having said all that cheesy intro stuff, I'm going to open the floor once again and give a little bit of apology. It's been a long time since I've done one of these, and I have figured out what I can do to fix that. I want to get on the microphone as often as I possibly can and record as many of these great episodes as I possibly can. And in order to do that, I sat down, I had a long conversation with myself and some of my closest friends and business partners and whatnot. And what I came to realize is that I need to turn this stuff, these episodes, into something that will, somewhat sustain myself and my life and whatnot. So, having said that, what we came to the conclusion of was I need to insert some sort of advertising into these podcasts. Now, I know that's a bit of a drag. No one likes ads, but hear me out. This is what will help to keep every single one of these episodes absolutely free for you. Okay? See, advertisers, they pay real dollars to people like myself who do these podcasts, and it's that money that will allow me to, use that to keep recording new episodes, to give me the incentive to keep recording and getting this content out to you and for free. Because after thinking about what it was that I wanted to get out of these episodes, I love getting feedback from people saying that I actually changed their lives with the information that I'm passing on to you. And I don't think I'd be able to reach as many people if this stuff wasn't free. So that's my plan. That's my plan going forward. And having said that, I'm going to say this now at the beginning and once again at the end. If you can please help me out, what I need to do to get this ball rolling is I need you to go and just fill out a quick survey for me. It literally takes 10 seconds, no more than that. You go through, you fill out, I think it's like 5 or 6 questions. There's only one, right answer for each question. If you can go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/survey. Okay. If you're on your computer, please pause this episode. Do that right now because that's how important this is to me to get this ball rolling on this stuff. Okay. If you're driving in your car, don't worry. I'm going to say again at the end of the episode, but try to make a mental note to do that. Go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/survey and then fill that out. Click submit, and you will have helped me out big time, and I thank you profusely. If you want, you can even email me and say, hey, Trevor, I filled out that survey for you, and I'll give you virtual high fives and all that stuff. All right? Sound good? Cool. So what I'm going to do is, I think in this episode, there's probably a whole bunch of reviews that are sitting in the backlog waiting for me to go through. But since I've had somewhat of a long intro already of me talking about this survey stuff and my plans for the future, I'm going to skip that stuff and do that in the next episode, which I will be recording shortly. This time, I promise, it's coming within probably less than a week, okay? So having said that, I'm going to go on to today's topic and just jump right into it. So without further ado, we are going to be expanding a little bit on what we were talking about in the last episode, which was about 2 months ago, so I had to go back and re-listen to it. But we're going to be talking a little bit more about the Spring Framework. Now, I want to sort of zoom in to the actual parameters that you can use inside of your methods, inside of your controllers, okay? So to give you a quick overview, if it's been, 2 months since you last listened to an episode, I'll give you a little refresher. We're talking about controllers. Now, controllers are part of the Spring Framework, and the Spring Framework is what we use to sort of elevate our Java game to the more broad web application level. It's known as J2EE Enterprise Edition. It's where you can actually, create an entire application and that will actually serve some sort of business purpose, as opposed to just creating a little single runnable application that will just run on your one desktop. So instead of talking about one desktop application, we're talking about the entire World Wide Web. So that's what the Spring Framework sort of allows us to do. Now, like I said in the last episode, there are other frameworks out there that you can use to accomplish the same thing. It's just that the Spring Framework is the one that I know the best. Plus, it integrates very well, obviously, with the Spring IDE, which is the integrated development environment that I've been using and teaching throughout my blogging and podcasting history. So we are going to be zooming in on the Spring Framework, onto controllers within the Spring Framework, and onto the parameters that you can have within your methods inside of your controllers. Okay, so cool. Again, controllers are Java classes, just a plain old Java object that you annotate with the @controller annotation, and that's just used to sort of as a a marker that can be used for Spring, so that the Spring Framework knows that this class should be treated as a controller. And then you have these methods, and like I said in the last episode, the methods are mapped. They're actually mapped using an annotation called the request mapping annotation, and that's what you use to sort of map a URL to an actual method inside of Java. So the example that I was using previously was the user login screen. Okay, so when I'm talking about what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the parameters that you can pass into the methods, this is going to be about the requests that you send, either a GET request or a POST request, that are sent from the sort of front end, the actual web site or the web page. Okay, so there's a user login screen. You have a username and password. You type in your username, your password, and you say submit. Okay, so now what happens is when you click on submit, Java will sort of take over, or rather the Spring Framework will take over, because there's a request that gets sent. That request gets intercepted, and the Spring Framework reads in that request and says, okay, do I have any controllers that match the URL that has been sort of submitted? So obviously you'll have to set that up properly via the request mapping annotations, which I talked about in the last episode. And if it's done so correctly, then it says, okay, I've got a method that I'm going to be using that matches this request. So for example, the request that we would send would be something like this. We'd have a username and a password, and there would be an actual URL that that username and password is being submitted from. So let's say it's the howtoprogramwithjava.com/login URL. Okay, now we're posting that data, which means we are sending the data to our server, and there's a difference between a get and a post, like I mentioned in the last episode, and that's not something I'm going to get into right now, but just know there's a difference between get and post. Mostly we use post when we are submitting data from a form, which is exactly what we're doing here. That's the typical use. We're submitting the username and password to the controller. So we have the howtoprogramwithjava.com/login. There you go. Boom. That's the URL that is matched inside of the Spring Framework. It matches it to a controller and to a method on a controller. Okay, so that's all fine and dandy. You were mostly familiar with this already since the last episode. Now here's where this episode comes into play. Once it matches that particular method, so let's say it's a public, a public model. It will return a model, and the class name could be user login post. Let's say you can name it whatever you like. That's a nice thing about the Spring Framework. You can name it whatever you like. So we'll just name it user login post, and then you have your parameter list. Okay, so this is where the magic starts to happen. So what are some of the parameters that we can pass in here for use in our method? And that is the beauty of the Spring Framework, or more so specifically Spring 3 and above. Okay, there's a bunch of versions of Spring, obviously from version 1.0 to 2.0, 2.5, 3.0, 3.1. I think we're in 3.2 or something like that right now. As of Spring, actually I lied. As of Spring 2.5, you can use these parameters in your list. But that's neither here nor there. I just want you to know that that's the sort of version of Spring that we're dealing with. I use Spring 3, and that's probably what you guys are going to be using as well, and that's what I would suggest. Now, inside of the parameters, what can you pass in? And the beauty is with Spring 3, you can pass in whatever you like. Okay, so you could pass in nothing really if you wanted to, which I don't know if I've ever done that before, because usually I at least at a very minimum pass in the model, because usually I want to deal with the model in some way, shape, or form. I want to either extract information from it, or I want to put information onto the model to send it back to whatever web page I want to render next. Okay. So at very minimum, I put a model in the parameter list. So let me expound on that a little bit. Let me talk about that a little bit. The model, like I said, we've talked about a few times in now 2 episodes past. And the model is what is used to essentially show, it holds your data. What data is it that you want to be dealing with and working with on your actual view, on your actual website, okay, the web page. So in terms of a login screen, let's see. When the user logs in, like I said, there's usually 2 things that happen. Either you get rejected or you get accepted. In the case that you get rejected, one thing I'd want to put on the model is maybe some sort of a message that says, your login was rejected because you have an invalid username or password, or maybe you'd want to say, that username doesn't even exist. Okay. Although in my opinion, that's sort of a bit of a security issue, because then someone can just keep on typing stuff in and then they'll be able to know exactly when they've hit a username that exists in the system. You know what I mean? So if you type in, let's say, username ABC, and you hit submit, and it says, oh, that username doesn't exist. Well, then that person knows, okay, that username doesn't exist. So they can start typing in a whole bunch of different usernames until they get the message that says, oh, you've entered an invalid username and password combination. So now they say, oh, okay, so I know that username exists. Now I just need to guess the password. You see what I mean? How that becomes a bit of a security issue. So generally, I just pass an error message that says, invalid username and password combination, and that's it. That way, I don't give away any secrets as to whether or not that username does or does not exist in the system. And usually, from a practical perspective, users don't really care that much to know whether or not their username is correct, because usually people know their username. But anyway, I'm getting off topic here. So that's an example of what you could do with the model if you are rejected from the server. So you'd pass in a message that says something like invalid username, password, and that's what you'd put in the model and send back to the view. And the view would render and say, okay, there you go, I have this error message, therefore I should display it. Okay, and in the instance where your login was successful, you take your model and you say, okay, now populate it with maybe the actual user information, the user object, so that when they log in, maybe you can display their username somewhere and say, welcome Trevor, or welcome whatever your username is, or something like that. That's another example of what you can do with the model. And again, this all correlates back to the point, which is you can put this model into the parameter list of your method that was matched by Spring via the URL that the person has accessed. Okay? Now I'm going to keep on explaining this because this is a very important concept when you're talking about the Spring framework. There's a request that gets sent. Someone goes to a website, howtoprograminjava.com/login, okay, and they say enter. They want to load the page. That's usually a GET request, okay, and that goes to the user login GET method. Let's say you've declared one that matches that particular URL pattern. The controller intercepts it and says, okay, boom, we've got a match. Here's the method. Do your stuff. Cool. The web page displays. The user types in the username, password, and says submit. Okay, they want to log in. Then that gets sent back to the server again. Now we have the same URL, howtoprograminjava.com/login, same URL, but this time it's a post request, and we can, tweak our annotations, our request mapping annotations appropriately to say, okay, since I've got specifically a post, this is the code I want to invoke, which is the user login post method. And then it does whatever it is that it needs to do with the information that you give it, which is by passing in the model in the actual parameter list. Okay, so the parameter list is where you can actually get information from the form that the user filled out, the username and password form. Okay, now that's the model. Other things that you can put into the parameter list could be an HTTP servlet request. Okay, so what this is for, it's the request. It's the actual information surrounding what it is that the user has sent over to you. Okay, and this is actually what Spring uses to sort of populate. If you remember in the last episode, I was talking about the model attribute annotation. The model attribute annotation allows you to quickly and easily populate a Java object with the information that came from the request. Okay, so like I said, when you type in your username and password, you type in, username Trevor, password, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, and say submit. That information gets sent along on the request. Okay, and so that can be read in, and it can populate an actual model attribute if you like. Now that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about the request right now. And the request, you can actually access it by just putting in the parameter list. You just put in HTTP servlet request, and then you give it a name. That's the variable type is HTTP servlet request. That's the variable type. Then you give it a variable name, just like any other parameter syntax. You have to give it an actual variable name. And generally, you usually name it request. That's kind of the convention. I always name it request. You could even name it R if you really want it to be very brief, whatever you like. So I'll name it request, and then you can actually access that object. It will be pre-populated. It won't be null. It will have all the information that is pertinent to that particular request that user has sent. Okay, so there's many uses. Oftentimes, what's a good practical example of the request? Okay, I just thought of one. When you want to get access to the session, you can do that via the request. Okay, so have I talked about sessions before? I'm not sure. Maybe I should give a quick blurb on that. A session is essentially set up when a user first hits your website. Okay, the user hits the website and starts browsing around. It sort of creates a session based on the first request that gets sent. I believe that's how it works. I'm catching myself off guard here, and I didn't actually go in and do the research on that. But that's more or less how it goes. You get a session, and that session is sort of more or less persisted on your system. I think it's actually within the browser, if I'm not mistaken. It gets stored in the browser, and you can put information into the session if you like. So one practical example would be once you log in, let's say you type in your username password and you successfully log in, you can extract that information from the request. Okay, the username and password, that's actually stored on the request. And then you can access the session, which is also inside the request. You just say request.getSession. And then you could say, okay, with that session object, put a user object onto the session, store it onto the session. So essentially what that does is it stores it within the browser itself, okay? So the browser will actually have stored the user object onto the session. And then what happens is when you close your browser or you flush your session or you flush your cache or whatever, then that information just goes bye-bye. It just gets erased and disappeared and forgotten. And then you're back to square one. But that's essentially what the session is about. It's persisted along the that particular, I don't want to say session, that particular, what's another word for session? I can't even think of one because I use it all the time when it comes to programming. So that particular, I just want to say session. I'm sorry, guys. When you're going through and navigating through certain pages within that website, let's say you've logged into howtoprogramjava.com, and now you want to change your profile picture. You want to go in and search through some of the comments that you've made or what have you, right? That's all part of the same session until you log out or you close down your browser, okay? Then the session gets wiped out. So having said that, that's all accessible through the HTTP servlet request, and you can just pass that in by just listing it as a parameter inside of your method. So the method we're talking about is the user login post method. And again, that gets accessed when someone clicks a submit button. When they typed in the username and password, they click submit. It submits a request, which is a post, okay, from the howtoprogramwithjava.com/login URL, gets matched to a particular method by Spring, the Spring framework. And since you have inserted the HttpServletRequest variable in the parameter list, boom, Spring will automatically populate the request for you, and you don't even have to think about it. You could just start using it, okay? Voila, beautiful. Now, as I was saying before, so there's two different ways of accessing what are called request parameters. Okay, so now I'm switching topics, switching content to a different parameter that you can use. Okay, and this one's actually an annotation, and it's called the request param annotation. Okay, they abbreviated it. It's a request parameter, but I don't know why they abbreviated it to just param, but that's what they did. At request param. And that's what you can use as sort of a shortcut, because to get the actual information inside of the request, the parameters stored inside of the request. Because oftentimes, I'm sure they've noticed, people are always trying to access that information from the request. They want to get access to the parameters. The parameters being the information that was submitted by the user from whatever form they submitted it through, okay? With the username and password that were submitted, those get stored in the request as parameters. All right, you can actually say request.getParameter, and then you can specify as strings the names of the parameters. So that usually we store them as, it's a username, we store it as a username, password is stored as password. So you would say request.getParameter, quote, username, end quote, close bracket, etc. And then you can get the actual username that was passed in. But that's just one line of code that you need to type in order to get the information. And wouldn't it be nice if there was an even easier way to do that? Well, there is. You can just type in at request param as an annotation, and then just type in, whatever it is that you want. If it's a variable type of a string, like it's a username, then you just type in string, you give it the name username, and voila. Now, Spring Framework will match that request parameter to that variable that you have listed in your parameter list for the user login post method. All right. So now, like I was saying at the beginning there's a bunch of different ways of doing this. One way is doing it the old school way, which is just saying request.getParameter, whatever. Fine, you can do that. Another way is to actually specify it with an annotation in your parameter list. That way it'll handle all the assigning of the variable and everything for you. Or you can do it via the @model attribute. Okay, and the @model attribute is a little bit different because it accesses multiple request parameters all at once. So let's say you have a username and a password, and a couple of other things that someone has filled out inside of the form that they've submitted. If those parameters match an entire object that you've set up with multiple parameters inside or properties inside, like a user object. Okay, a user object has a username, password, and some other stuff. Then you can use the @model attribute to map multiple parameters directly into your user object. Okay, so there's a bunch of different ways of accessing that same information, and your usage will vary depending on the situations that you find yourself in. Okay, with programming, there's always multiple ways of solving the same problem, but oftentimes there's a handful of best solutions, a handful of good solutions, and quite a few bad solutions. Okay, so it's just a matter of experience and knowing, through experience, which ones work well and which ones don't. Okay, so this is where I'm trying to help you guys out by telling you the different ways that you can access these parameters via the different parameters that you can list in your methods that you map with your request mapping annotations with Spring Framework. Okay, so let's see. What other parameters do you use or could you use? We talked about request, we talked about model, we talked about at request parameters, we talked about at model attributes. Oh, there's a HTTP servlet response. Okay, we talked about request, which is the information flowing from the website to your Java server. That's a request. But then you can go the other way too. You can have a response, and the response is sent the other way from the server to the HTML page. Okay, and this, there's a, I don't often use the response object very much anymore, just because usually you can handle it all via the model attribute. You can store whatever it is that you want to store in the model, and I'm sure that the Spring framework behind the scenes must populate the response for you on your behalf. They're just making it easier. They're sort of making it a more abstract functionality. It sort of takes the work away from you, but then you sort of get out of touch with how this stuff actually works. So when you're populating a model, I'm sure what they do is they populate the response. And once again, I'm saying this out loud without doing any sort of research ahead of time, which I apologize for. I didn't expect to talk about that, but that's sort of what makes sense to me. In order to pass information back from the server to the client or the website, it's usually done through the response. And if you're passing model attributes or model information back to the page, I can only infer that it's done through the response. So having said that, you absolutely do use the response, but usually it's through other means like using the model. One way that I've actually physically used a response before is when I'm dealing with something called JSONP. Now, do I want to? I guess I might as well touch a little bit on that, just to give you some perspective on why it is that I'm mentioning it. When you are dealing with something called JSON is known as JavaScript object notation. So JavaScript object notation is something that is used when it's as sort of a blanket way to have information passed from any server to any website. All right. So here's the situation is you could have a Java server, you could have a PHP server, you could have a Ruby on Rails thing going on. You could have a C# application. You could have an Objective-C app. There's a whole bunch of different languages that you can use, and they all have their vastly different types of technologies backing them. But there needs to be a very easy or common way to be able to communicate between a server and a website. Okay, and websites use HTML. We've talked about that, but they also could use something called JavaScript. Okay, JavaScript is something, it's quite different from Java, so I don't want you guys to get confused about JavaScript and thinking it's very much like Java. The syntax is a little bit similar to Java, but it is definitely a completely different beast altogether. So these websites can have JavaScript, and thus there's something called JavaScript object notation, which we can use as a sort of generic way to communicate between any kind of server to a website. Okay, so having said that, there is a way that you can communicate across domains. Okay, so this is again one level deeper, and I'm just going to be very brief on this. To be able to, let's say, communicate from, let's say I have had a program with java.com, and I want to extract information from, let's say, what's a good example? Let's say the stock market. I want to be able to access the stock market, and I want to be able to get information from the stock market via a website. Okay, like let's say I'm sure Google has some sort of financial stock market data. I don't often work with any of that kind of stuff. Let me see if I can find Google. I think it's called like Finance or something like that. Does that make sense? Stock market quotes. There you go. So Google Finance. You want to communicate with Google Finance, and you want to get stock market information. So in order to communicate from howtoprogramwithjava.com to Google Finance and extract information from their server. And let's just say Google doesn't use a Java server. Let's say they use some other random server. I want to extract information from them. They will pass it in a JavaScript object notation fashion. And in order to communicate from howtoprogramwithjava.com to Google Finance, it's done through JSONP. Okay, and JSONP allows for something called cross-domain communication, and that's very important. There's a difference between JSON and JSONP. I don't want to get into that, but in order to communicate between websites, you need something called JSONP, and it's still the same thing. It's the same concept. It's still a JavaScript object notation. It just has something called padding, but it allows that cross-domain communication. So, having said that, I have found that it is sometimes needed for me to manually access the response object and sort of pass in a predictable response to my own website. Okay, so that is one long explanation for one use case that I've run into with having to deal with directly an HTTP servlet response object inside of my parameter list. Now that's very advanced stuff, okay? Talking about JSON and something called AJAX. That is something that I have not talked about yet, and that is definitely something I will be talking about. But that's more so along the lines of dealing with the actual HTML stuff. And I said I didn't want to get into HTML and the client-side stuff just yet. Since this is the How to Program with Java podcast, I want to be talking about Java stuff. Therefore, I want to talk and focus on the Spring framework. So, having said that, fair enough. You know now that you can use an HTTP servlet response object. You could put that into your parameter list, and you can use it if you like. But right now there's maybe no real reason why you'd want to do that. But like I said, there's always tons of different ways to solve the same problem. So if you really wanted to, you could directly deal with the response object and pass that back and modify it and all that stuff. And it will really allow you to get to know the process, get to know how the servers communicate, or the web page can communicate with the server and back and forth. And then you can get quite intimately knowledgeable with that kind of thing. If that's your cup of tea, fair enough. I tend to like to go the easier route and take the path more frequently traveled, which is just dealing with the model object and that kind of thing. So, cool, clear as mud, cool. All right, so now let's move on to the listener questions segment of this episode. And from my notes that I've taken from a long while ago, this is back in August, which for those of you who are not, or who are listening to this in the future, that's about 2 months ago is when this question came in. So I'm a little bit late on answering that, and I apologize, but it's from a listener by the name of Matt Hogan. And he says, one topic I would love to learn about is enterprise Java, and more specifically, Maven. Everybody talks about it, and I would love to learn more about it. Thanks, and you are truly appreciated every day that I listen to your podcast. Cool. So, thank you, Matt, for that great question. So he says he wants to learn about enterprise Java. Well, guess what? That is exactly what I've been talking about in the last episode as well as this episode. So hopefully, Matt, you have gotten a lot out of these two episodes, and hopefully you're following along more or less with the teachings that I'm trying to humbly pass on to you. But he also asked about Maven. Okay, now Maven is a sort of different beast altogether. Now, I was also very curious about Maven a little while back before I was actually, decided to delve into the world of Maven, and I'm quite glad I did, because here's the problems I used to run into, and here's what Maven did to solve those problems for me. Okay. Actually, let me step back one step. Let me explain what Maven is, and then I'll go into how it helped me. So essentially what Maven does, and let me go to the actual Maven website. Maven is spelled M-A-V-E-N, Okay, it's by a company called Apache. And like I said before, Apache is a very well-respected name in terms of Java and Java programming. They produce a lot of great open source, free-to-use products and packages that we can sort of plug into our programming and just makes our lives so much easier. But let me read their little blurb. It says, Apache Maven is a software project management and comprehension tool. Based on the concept of a project object model. Geez, that's a mouthful. Project object model, POM for short, POM. Maven can manage a project's build, reporting, and documentation from a central piece of information. Okay, so that's kind of a very generic and somewhat wordy explanation as to what Maven does for you. So now let me explain in my words what it is that I use Maven for and how it helps me. Maven helps you essentially manage your dependencies. Okay, so here's an example of me using a project without Maven. Okay, let's say I want to set up a new web project and I want to do this to build a website or something like that. I want to build a website that maybe it's like a Facebook application. I want to have, like I said, my user login screen. Then you can log in, you can go and you can post messages and you can, connect with friends, etc. Well, in order to build this application, I decide that I want to use Spring, okay? And I also decide that I want to have a database. So therefore, I want to have some sort of a persistence framework that allows me to talk between my Java and my database. Okay, so for that I choose this technology called Hibernate. Okay, so in order to use these technologies, I obviously need to bring in the files that will allow me to use those technologies. I need to plug in those files into my my workspace, my code, in order to use that information, in order to use those frameworks. Okay, so how do I do that? Well, without Maven, you need to go to, let's say, the Spring Framework website, and I need to find all of the files that are needed to use Spring. So let's say there's 3 different files. They're usually jar files. Let's say there's a Spring core.java or .jar file. There's a Spring tools.jar file, and there's a Spring project.jar file. And these are the 3 main jar files that you need to use and plug into your application in order to use Spring. Okay, cool. So you download those 3 files, and then you put them in something like a library directory or something inside of your application. And then you have to go and you put them on your class path, which is done by right-clicking on your project, going to properties, going to build path or class path or something like that. Clicking on those 3 libraries, adding them, saying, okay, whatever. Boom, there you go. You've added those 3 library files. So now you would assume that everything will start to work and you can start to use this Spring framework technology. And let's say the same goes for Hibernate. You need to go and get a few Hibernate files and import them and go through that same process that I just explained. Okay, cool, done. So now you would assume that everything would work just fine. So you go and you click start. You want to start your, let's say your server, your web server, and you wait. And then you see a whole bunch of red text, and you see a whole bunch of errors, and you say, what the heck is this? And it says something about, let's say it can't find the class called, what's a good example? Hold on, let me open up my my project here. I always get hit with this one. Let me go to Maven dependencies. Sorry guys. Okay, so let's say it says can't find commons lang or something like that. Something to do with commons lang. And you're like, what the heck? What is commons lang? What does that got to do with anything? And then you do some research and you type this error in. You say, okay, what's this error I'm getting? And someone says, oh, you are using a piece of technology that depends on commons lang, and therefore you must put commons lang onto your class path. And then you realize, oh, well, Spring is what's causing the problem. Spring requires me to use commons lang. oh, okay, well, that's easy to solve. So I'll go and look up this commons lang thing because it's some sort of language file. And okay, there you go. I found it. It's a jar file. Fine, there we go. So I download that jar file and I put it onto my class path, and then I go ahead and restart my server. Okay, and then you think, all right, everything's going to be okay now. I found that one little file that that Spring needed, so I'm going to be okay. But then another error comes up and it says, oh, can't find class aspect J or something. And then you scratch your head, what the heck is aspect J? So then you copy paste that error into Google, and then you see another message from someone saying, oh, I'm having the same problem, and someone answers it by saying, oh, well, the Spring framework requires aspect J, so you need to go and find that jar file and put it onto your class path. Okay? Oh, so then you go and do that. You find the aspect J jar file, you put on your class path, you restart, and then you see where I'm going with this? Another error appears, and it says, oh, you need to use commons collection now. And it's like, well, you're tearing your hair out, and you're saying, well, what the heck are all these stupid files, and why do I keep needing to import them? I thought I just needed to import this silly Spring files and all that stuff. Well, these are things called dependencies, all right? And this is really annoying stuff, and it's very annoying because each time that I've said that you have something that you need to import, those things can have different versions. So remember that commons lang thing that I was talking about? If you're using Spring 3.0 and then you import commons lang 1.0, thinking that that'll work, there's still going to be a problem because Spring Framework 3.0 could reference something within commons lang that was only introduced in version 2.6. So then you've got version 1.0 and not 2.6, and then there's a problem again. So there's this very annoying process that you need to go through. Very it's frustrating as it's all get out, just to try to set all this stuff up and find the correct versions of all these stupid dependencies and put them on your class path. And I'm hoping that you are feeling the pain right now in my voice. I'm hoping you can hear it in my voice and how frustrating it is. So obviously there must be a better way. Well, there is. Thank God there is. So that's where Maven comes in. Maven allows you to manage, one part of Maven at least, allows you to manage those dependencies. Now, it's not a perfect solution, okay? It still has its own little quirks, and it still has its own little things that drive you mad, but it is far better to use Maven than to do it the manual way, which is what I was just talking about. So with Maven, you can use something called a POM file, P-O-M file, which is a project object model file, which is used to sort of define what it is that you want to use inside of your project on a more, on a more high level, okay? So you can say, okay, I want to use Spring, therefore I want to use those three files, whatever I said, Spring Core, Spring Project, and Spring something or other, I forget what I said. You can put that information into your POM file, and the POM file is an XML file. If you've used XML, then you'll be very comfortable with that. If you've never used it, well, that's something you're going to have to learn a little bit about. But you can put that information into your POM file, and you specify those three files, Spring, whatever, and then Maven will go and find all the dependencies and find the correct versions of all those dependencies and sort of download them and plug them into your project for you. Okay, that is so amazing, so powerful. It's such a time saver. And what's beautiful about that process is hopefully you guys have never hit that process, because if you're following through with some of my teachings about Spring Roo, you can use Spring Roo, which is built into the Spring IDE, to rapidly create a web application, and Spring Roo integrates with Maven. Okay, so it pulls in Maven and it creates a POM file for you and populates it with all the appropriate things that you need to get off the ground and running. So maybe you haven't even run into these problems and you're like, what the heck are you talking about, Trevor, with class not found and all this stuff. And if you've never run into that problem, good for you. That's so awesome. You're clearly on the right path. And if you have run into those problems, then you should look into using Apache Maven. Okay, so it helps you with your dependencies. It helps you to download them, to get the correct versions of them, and to get it, integrated into your project so that you don't have to rip your hair out trying to do all of that manually. Now, another cool thing about Maven is you can sort of click a few buttons. You can right click and say, Maven, and then you can say download sources, okay? And what happens is you can actually download all the source code of all of the dependencies that you have, which is really nice because let's say, for example, there's some sort of error that happens and it's inside of the Spring framework. Okay, let's say there's a null pointer exception inside of the Spring framework code. If you haven't imported or downloaded all the sources and documentation files, then you won't be able to look into the actual code. You won't be able to see exactly and debug exactly what it is that's causing problems inside of the Spring framework. All you're going to see is a very ugly white screen with a bunch of black text, and it's not, well structured or anything like that. So you can use Maven to automatically go and download all those source files and put them in there for you, so that when you do hit an error, you can just click on, the Spring file where the error is happening, and then boom, up pops the Spring code, right? It's just completely seamless. You just have the code right in front of you, and you can step through it and debug it, and look at variables, and you can treat it just like it was your own code, and that's really, really, really useful stuff. Many times when I've just been pulling my hair out, caught a certain bug for so many days or weeks, sometimes I just need to dig into other people's code and see, either is it their code that's wrong? Usually it's not. Or is it something that I'm doing and I'm interacting with their code in such a way that was not expected, and therefore there's an error happening and I need to fix that, okay? So that's where Maven can step in and help you out. And there's apparently other stuff that Maven can do, like it says, managing a project's build, so that's pretty much the stuff that I was talking about. Reporting, I'm not exactly sure what reporting Maven has, but there you go. That's definitely something that it does apparently that I'm sure would be useful. I just don't know about it. And documentation. So I don't know if it means documentation in terms of getting the source code documentation and being able to download it. If that's what it means, and like I said, that's great stuff. If it's not, if it's stuff that I still haven't even used before, then fantastic. That's awesome. So there you go. That's in a nutshell what Maven is, and it's very useful. And I highly recommend you if you're creating your own web application. Just go ahead and use some of the templates that the Spring IDE has. I think if you go, I'm just going to go to my Spring IDE right now. If you say new, you say file new, you can create a dynamic web project. And when you create a dynamic web project, I believe you can it can actually integrate with Maven, and also you can use Spring and all that stuff in there, which is great. Or you can just fire up your Spring Roo and follow through and actually create an actual application based on Spring Roo to get you set up with the essentially the framework for your application, which is just so useful because, like I said, it brings in all those stuff for you, like the Spring framework, and maybe if you want to use Hibernate, you can. Plus, it brings in Maven, and it creates a POM file for you, and it's so useful. It's so much easier now than it used to be, or at least than I used to go about doing it in a bad way before. Now it's just so much easier because of all these great tools that have been created to help us out. So there you go. Hopefully, Matt, that has answered your question about Maven, and you are now more familiar with it. My one tip with using Maven is everything happens in the POM file, pom.xml. Search for the POM file. If you're using a POM file, search for it and read about it and understand. Mostly you're going to be dealing in the dependencies section of the POM file. Again, it's an XML file. You'll see in the dependencies section a whole bunch of different dependencies. That's where you're going to mostly be playing around with, and you can actually go online and look up Maven dependencies and exactly the XML code that you should be using when you want to start to use some sort of library. Usually it's available on the Maven directory. So you can just type in, for example, you can type in Spring Framework Maven into Google. And then when you do that, actually let me do that right now, Spring Framework Maven, you'll do it. And the first thing that comes up is Maven repository org.spring-framework. And I can click on that, and you see all the different, they call them artifacts. These are essentially the little components that go along with the overall libraries. So there's all these artifacts like Spring Core, Spring Bean, Spring Test, and it says what the latest version is, and you can just click on it. And when you click on it, it gives you the actual Maven dependency code, the XML that you would need to use with something called a group ID, which is org.spring-framework, so that you can group your application together with a group ID. And it has the artifact ID, which in this case is Spring Context, and the version, which is 3.2.4. There you go. It creates all that code for you, so you just copy paste it into your Maven POM file in the right spot, and there you go. Now Maven will go get the Spring Framework artifact, the Spring Context artifact, I should say, download it all, and get all the dependencies, and it shows you what all the dependencies that the Spring Context artifact ID depends on. It depends on things like JRuby, Groovy, Bash, AspectJ Weaver, JodaTime, Validation API, Persistence API, JavaX Inject, all these different dependencies that if you didn't know about, you'd have to go and download all these things on your own, and there's like 20 listed here, and you'd have to manually import them, and that would just drive you crazy. So it does it all for you. It's fantastic. I absolutely love it. Huge time saver. Can't say enough good things about Maven. So there you go, Matt. I think hopefully that not only helped Matt out, but it helped you guys out as well in expanding your concept of what you can do with this Java technology stuff. All right. So now that I've been talking your ear off for almost an hour now, I will bring this session to a close. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I need you to help me out. So if you are getting close to ending your drive right now, if you're sitting at your computer, if you're walking somewhere with your smartphone and you're listening to this, this is where I need you to do something for me. This is really going to help me out. This is going to help to keep all these episodes free, and it's going to help keep these episodes coming on a much more regular basis. One episode every 2 months is not good enough. I want to release at least one episode a week, if not more, okay? So this is what's going to help me to do that for you guys. So go on your computer or your smartphone or whatever, log it in your brain right now. Go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/survey, SURVEY, survey. And that will take you to a survey. It takes like 10 seconds to fill out. It's just it's information that allows my advertisers. I say my advertisers. I don't have any yet. This is the whole point of filling out the survey. This will help connect advertisers to you guys in terms of connecting them through my podcast. So this isn't you're not gonna be contacted by advertisers directly. No, this is all about informing my advertisers of who my listeners are. Because who are my listeners? How old are you? Are you male? Are you female? That kind of thing, just generic things. And that way we can find advertisements that will match you guys and actually benefit you guys. So, who knows what they may or may not be, but now it's much more targeted, and you guys can actually maybe get something out of it. Maybe people will start advertising about Java products. Who knows, right? So this is where the survey will help, and it will help me attract advertisers, and it will help me to keep these episodes free. So please, by all means, right now, pause this episode, stop it, do whatever, go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/survey, fill that stuff out, and I need 250 people. 250, okay? So far, as of, October 9th, when I'm recording this, 2013, I have, I think, like 5 people who I've had fill it out. And I haven't, posted this information anywhere publicly yet, so obviously that's why I don't have that many. So I essentially need 245 more people. So if you're listening to this, and you go and you do that right now, I know I have at least 1,000 people who listen to this podcast on a regular basis. 1,000 people, okay? So if you go and you do that right now, I will have 1,000 entries, and we'll be done. We'll be done in the next, 12 hours. Then I won't have to ever ask you to do this again. We'll walk away. We're happy. I can keep recording these things, keeping this information free. You can keep learning and maybe, change your whole life. That would be fantastic if you could do that. So help me help you. That's the old, Jerry Maguire line. Help me help you. howtoprograminjava.com/survey. All right? Cool. Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves, guys. As always, happy learning, and can't wait to see you in the next episode. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.